During a heated House hearing, U.S. Representative Maxine Waters shocks the room by publicly calling Vice President J.D. Vance a thug. But what happens next leaves everyone speechless. J.D. Vance's calm but brutal response flips the narrative instantly and stuns even his harshest critics. What did he say? Why did Maxine look stunned? This moment is going viral for all the right reasons. It was supposed to be a routine oversight hearing. Lawmakers filed in, journalists lined the walls, and the cameras were rolling. But something felt different. The energy in the chamber was off, heavy, like a thunderstorm about to break. Vice President J.D. Vance sat calmly at the witness table. He wasn't there to defend himself. He had volunteered to testify in support of a law cracking down on government corruption. Representative Maxine Waters, a seasoned Democrat with over 30 years in Congress, sat across from him, her eyes burned with contempt. The chairman banged his gavel. This hearing is now in session. What followed started as standard political banter, but then it happened. In the middle of her questioning, Waters leaned into her mic and with a smirk said, "With all due respect, Mr. Vance, you don't belong here. You're nothing but a thug in a suit." Gasps exploded in the room. Aides froze. Cameras zoomed in. The insult hung in the air like poison. J.D. Vance didn't flinch. He simply looked at her with eyes that didn't blink. Something was about to happen. Something no one in that room was ready for. Silence. For a full 5 seconds, J.D. Vance didn't say a word. He looked at Maxine Waters the way a soldier stares down an enemy, not with rage but with resolve. Then he leaned forward, calm, controlled, but with a voice that shook the walls. "Ma'am, I've served this country. I've raised a family in Ohio's poorest neighborhoods, and I've fought for Americans forgotten by the system. You want to call me a thug?" He paused, scanning the room. "You who have been in Congress for 32 years while your district still suffers in poverty. You who funneled taxpayer money into your own family's businesses while grandmothers in Watts can't afford their medicine." Maxine shifted uncomfortably. Whispers filled the chamber. A CNN anchor's pen dropped audibly to the floor. "You don't get to call me a thug," Vance said, his voice low now. "Not while you sit in power, dripping with the kind of corruption that keeps black kids without hope and poor families without water." Maxine's face went pale. He wasn't shouting, but every word cut deeper than a scream ever could. Maxine tried to interrupt, but the chairman raised his hand. "Let him speak." J.D. Vance placed a folder on the desk in front of him. Slowly, he opened it. This is a report publicly available, but conveniently ignored for years. It contains records of how you directed over $12 million in community grants straight to organizations run by your relatives. A shocked murmur spread across the room. You claimed it was for job training, but one of those nonprofits hosted exactly 3 workshops in 4 years. Meanwhile, your nephew bought a second home in Beverly Hills. Maxine's hands trembled slightly. J.D. continued, "There's more. Wire transfers, federal housing kickbacks, lobbyist deals hidden in plain sight. You've used your position not to serve the people, but to serve yourself." Tears welled up in the eyes of a young black woman seated behind Vance. A reporter whispered, "This is career-ending." Vance ended with a whisper. "You can call me anything you want, Representative Waters, but today the people will finally see who you really are." And for the first time in 30 years, Maxine Waters had no words. J.D. Vance held up a document with a government seal. "This memo was buried in a housing and urban development report from 5 years ago," he said clearly, facing the cameras. "It shows how Congresswoman Waters pushed for funds to be redirected to an L.A. housing project. But guess who owned the land behind that deal?" He paused. "Her daughter under a different name." The gallery gasped. One of Maxine's aides ducked their head. "You called me a thug, ma'am," J.D. said, now locking eyes with her again. "But thugs don't hide behind legislation and exploit the very people they claim to defend. They don't pretend to be righteous while pocketing what belongs to the people." Maxine reached for her mic but said nothing. J.D.'s voice grew firmer. "I came here to speak truth, not be insulted. And I won't sit quiet while you spit on hardworking Americans with your lies and luxury." Reporters rushed out of the room to file breaking news alerts. J.D. Vance had flipped the script in less than 10 minutes and he wasn't done yet. Outside the hearing room, the moment had already gone viral. Within an hour, clips of J.D. Vance's response hit every platform: YouTube, X, Instagram, TikTok. Did y'all see what J.D. Vance just did to Maxine Waters? A teenage girl in Atlanta wept while watching the clip. He's speaking for my grandma, she whispered. For people who have been ignored. Cable news networks scrambled to cover the story. CNN labeled it the congressional showdown of the year. Fox called it a turning point. But inside the room, J.D. Vance remained calm as if he wasn't even aware of the tidal wave forming outside. He simply placed another folder on the desk. This next file, he said softly, shows how federal COVID relief funds intended for small black-owned businesses in South LA were rerouted conveniently after a phone call from Representative Waters' office. Maxine looked visibly shaken. The mask was cracking. The room felt like a courtroom now, quiet, heavy. A single tear rolled down the cheek of a woman in the second row. She had testified before Maxine's subcommittee years ago. Her voice had been ignored, but today J.D. Vance spoke the words she had longed to hear. Your community trusted you, J.D. continued, his voice now trembling slightly. Mothers cried in food lines while your family held campaign fundraisers at five-star hotels. That's not leadership, that's betrayal. Maxine sat frozen. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. J.D. gently closed the folder. Then he said something no one expected. This isn't personal, Congresswoman. It's painful. I grew up with nothing. I know how it feels to be forgotten. But when you turn your back on your people for power, someone has to speak. A young black reporter in the gallery wiped her eyes. Her whisper caught on a hot mic. I never thought a Republican could make me cry like this. And just like that, the nation began to listen. J.D. Vance turned slightly, looking beyond the committee members and directly into the gallery. This isn't just about Washington, he said. It's about the forgotten mothers in South Central LA who buried their sons while the leaders they voted for bought new watches. His words were slow, clear, personal. You see, when I was a kid, I watched my mom cry because we couldn't afford rent. Nobody called us. Nobody cared. And now, when I see that the same pain still lives in neighborhoods you claim to represent, Congresswoman, I have to ask, what exactly have you been doing for 30 years? Maxine Waters blinked hard, her lips pursed tightly. J.D. pulled out a handwritten letter. This is from a little girl named Tamika. She's 11. She wrote to your office twice asking for help to get her grandma into a better home. No one answered. That was 2 years ago. Tamika's letter was heartbreaking. It spoke of roaches, no hot water, and a grandma too sick to climb the stairs. J.D. read it aloud, and by the end, half the room was silent, wiping away tears. This is why I came today, for Tamika. Maxine tried to regain her composure. She leaned toward her mic, voice shaking. Mr. Vance, this is political theater. You're using children to make me look bad. But J.D. didn't let her finish. He calmly held up a photo of Maxine smiling at a ribbon-cutting ceremony in front of a luxury apartment complex. You stood here praising affordable housing. What no one said was that 70% of the units went out of state investors, not the people from your district. The projector flickered on. Documents, emails, bank statements, all showing her involvement in shell corporations tied to her relatives. A young aide behind Maxine dropped a folder and ran out of the room. You didn't just fail your people, J.D. said softly. You used them. You stood on their pain to build yourself a throne made of lies. Even members of her own party were now looking away, embarrassed. The room felt like a courtroom again, but this time it wasn't J.D. on trial. Maxine Waters was unraveling live before the nation. J.D. paused and took a deep breath. I don't enjoy this. This isn't revenge, it's reckoning. He turned to the chairman. I request permission to enter into record-signed testimonies from former staffers who left Representative Waters' office due to ethics violations. Approved. One testimony read, I was told to lie on expense reports, told to redirect community calls to a voicemail no one checked. Maxine sat slumped now. Her voice was gone, her eyes glossy. J.D. turned again to the people. If this is what representation looks like, then our people deserve better. Our democracy deserves better. Then, breaking all expectation, J.D. Vance looked at Maxine and said something no one saw coming. I forgive you, gasps shock. Because this isn't about hate, it's about healing. And healing starts when truth walks in and lies walk out. The room broke into quiet applause, the sound of tears. A humbling shift had taken place. And across America, millions of hearts began to open. As J.D. Vance gently placed the final piece of evidence on the table, the cameras kept rolling. The entire country was watching. But what no one saw coming was the ripple outside the chamber. In Los Angeles, a group of elderly black residents gathered in a tiny community center. Someone connected a laptop to the TV. They watched the hearing in silence. When J.D. read Tamika's letter again, one of the women, Miss Geraldine, 87 years old and living on $740 a month, broke down. "That girl lives on my street," she whispered, clutching her chest. She wasn't lying. Another woman stood up and cried out. "Maxine's been using us for years." The video had made it out of Washington into the streets that mattered. J.D.'s words weren't just political, they were personal. Meanwhile, back in the chamber, Maxine Waters still hadn't spoken. Her staff whispered, her lawyers looked tense. And the Democrats on the panel were unusually quiet, and J.D., he wasn't finished. "This is bigger than parties," he said. "This is about pain, real generational pain. And today it finally has a voice." J.D. Vance's voice grew quiet. "Let me tell you something you won't find in any file or folder." He stood up, adjusted his jacket, then leaned on the desk. "I'm not a polished man. I didn't come from wealth or elite schools. I'm a man who shoveled mud, changed tires, and buried friends before age 20. So when someone like you calls someone like me a thug, I know what you mean." The room froze. The word echoed in every mind. "You don't mean criminal. You mean poor. You mean working class. You mean unwelcome in the very place my mother used to pray I'd one day reach." One of the junior representatives, who had been skeptical of Vance, lowered his head. Another woman on the committee clutched her pen until it snapped. "But I stand here today as Vice President of the United States, not because of corruption, not because of payoffs, but because I kept showing up when the world said I didn't belong." Tears, not from J.D., but from the audience. "So no, Congresswoman Waters, I'm not a thug. I'm every man you've forgotten." Maxine Waters finally reached for her mic. Her hand trembled. The arrogance she wore at the start of the hearing had melted, but before she could speak, J.D. cut in gently. "No more words, ma'am. Just one question. When was the last time you walked your district without cameras?" Dead silence. "When was the last time you sat with a grieving mother without handing her a pre-written speech?" The question hit harder than all the documents, all the emails, all the bank statements. Maxine didn't answer. She couldn't. J.D. slowly walked over and placed a photo in front of her. It was from 5 years ago. A memorial for a boy named Deshaun shot in a drive-by. Maxine had promised the family reforms, but nothing came. J.D. looked at her, not with anger now, but sorrow. "You forgot him, but his mother didn't forget you." Cameras captured it. Maxine Waters, stunned, silent, and for the first time ashamed. And across the country, hearts began to break. Not just for J.D., but for the truth. As the hearing went into a brief recess, the hallway outside the chamber swarmed with journalists, aides, and stunned onlookers. Nobody expected what had just happened. Not in a million years. Did J.D. really just dismantle her entire career without yelling once? A Capitol staffer whispered. A CNN reporter stood frozen, watching the clip replay on a phone. Even political rivals were shaken, not by scandal but by truth. Inside a small break room, 2 of Maxine Waters' former staffers sat quietly, both in tears. One of them, a young black man named Jerome, finally spoke. "Everything he said, we saw it happen. I used to believe in her." The other replied, "Until we weren't allowed to return calls from people in the projects because they weren't strategic." Meanwhile, J.D. Vance sat alone at the witness table, flipping through a small stack of letters written by people from Watts and Compton. His hands trembled, but not from fear, from the weight of their pain. He wasn't done. The nation had heard the truth, but the people deserved justice, and justice was coming before the hearing ended. The recess ended. Everyone returned to their seats. Maxine walked in slower this time. Her eyes didn't scan the room. They stared at the floor. The chairman gave J.D. the floor one last time. He stood. "I know some of you came today thinking this would be politics as usual, that this would be a debate. It's not." He turned toward Maxine again, but this time his voice was softer. "This is a reckoning." He raised one final piece of paper. "This document shows over $4 million in housing repair funds missing from projects in Inglewood and Watts, while those homes sat mold-infested, leaking, and unsafe." He didn't yell, he didn't even sound angry, but the words hit harder than any speech. "This came from a whistleblower. Your whistleblower, someone who used to believe in you." A man in the gallery gasped. It was the contractor who tried to fix those homes and got cut out of the deal. Maxine Waters began to shake. The hearing room wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a graveyard where a 3-decade career was being buried. Maxine finally stood, her voice quivering. "This is a personal attack. This is about destroying a black woman in power." J.D. Vance shook his head gently. "No, ma'am. This is about restoring dignity to the people you promised to protect." He stepped closer, not with anger but with the grace of someone who had carried burdens his whole life. "Being black isn't what made you corrupt. Power did, and power without humility destroys everything it touches." The room gasped. Several lawmakers lowered their heads. "If this hearing was just about race, ma'am, I wouldn't be standing here, but it's not. It's about truth, and truth doesn't care about titles." Maxine's eyes welled up, but she turned away. She had no more answers. J.D. placed the letter from Tamika beside her mic. "You never answered her. Maybe now you'll listen." The chamber fell into a deep, painful silence. And outside, across the country, hearts were shattering. Not because someone had been destroyed, but because someone finally stood up for the forgotten. As Maxine Waters sat back down, she avoided eye contact. The fire she came in with had turned to quiet regret. Her fingers tapped nervously on the desk, but her mouth stayed shut. J.D. Vance looked around. "This isn't about vengeance. I'm not here to humiliate anyone. I'm here because the people who trusted you need answers." He turned toward the gallery again. "There's a woman sitting here today named Mrs. Claudine Harris. She's 72. Her ceiling caved in last winter. She called her representative's office 7 times. No one ever called her back." Gasps echoed again. Cameras swiveled to an elderly woman seated in the 3rd row, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "She came here from California on a borrowed ticket just to finally be seen." J.D. continued, voice trembling slightly. "She's not asking for riches, just safety, just dignity, just what she was promised by the person she voted for." The audience looked at Maxine, but Maxine kept staring at the table. Something had shifted. The story was no longer just political. It was personal. It was real, and America could feel it. J.D. Vance leaned forward one final time. He opened a small black notebook filled with handwritten notes. Not legal documents, not speeches, just stories. "This isn't opposition research. These are letters, voicemails, cries, people who believed and were abandoned." He held up the notebook, hand trembling just slightly. "They trusted you, Representative Waters. They believed in your words, and in return they got silence, mold, broken promises." Maxine looked up, her face was blank, her voice absent. "Say something," whispered a reporter under their breath, but she didn't. And in that moment her silence said everything. One by one, members of the audience began to cry. A mother held her child tighter. A young man clapped slowly, just once, then again. Soon the gallery erupted in standing applause. J.D. didn't smile. He just nodded and whispered, "They matter. Not me, them." For 30 years, Maxine had controlled the narrative. But in just one morning, J.D. Vance gave it back to the people. The chairman looked at the time. "Mr. Vice President, you've made your point. This hearing is nearing its close." J.D. Vance nodded, then stood tall. He looked directly at Maxine for the final time. "I didn't come here to end your career, ma'am. That was your choice. I just turned on the light." Maxine's face broke. She blinked rapidly, then lowered her head. The room was silent again, but it wasn't the silence of tension anymore. It was the silence of a curtain falling. As J.D. walked out of the hearing room, reporters didn't shout questions. They stood respectfully, quiet, watching. Outside, Mrs. Claudine Harris held his hand and whispered, "God sent you." And just like that, J.D. Vance, once mocked as a thug in a suit, walked into history as the man who didn't yell, didn't fight, but still brought justice with the truth. As J.D. Vance walked through the Capitol hallway, his footsteps echoed against marble floors now filled with silent respect. He wasn't surrounded by bodyguards. He didn't need a crowd, but everywhere he passed, people stood back and watched. Some nodded, some wept. Inside a nearby committee room, a group of young congressional interns sat watching the live feed, huddled around a laptop. One whispered, "I used to think J.D. was just another loud voice, but today he became something different." Another said he didn't defend himself with pride, he defended the people with pain. Meanwhile, clips of his speech were flooding social media, but it wasn't just the usual crowd. Black pastors in Georgia, single mothers in Detroit, veterans in Kentucky, all saying the same thing. "He spoke for us." And somewhere in Ohio, a retired coal miner with trembling hands whispered, That man, he understands. In just one morning, a word meant to tear him down, thug, had been flipped, redeemed, rewritten, and J.D. Vance hadn't fought back with rage. He had answered with truth. Back at CNN headquarters, producers rushed into the control room. The clip of J.D.'s confrontation had reached 12 million views in under 2 hours. A veteran anchor stared at the screen and murmured, "We've never seen a hearing like this." Fox News was running the headline. Vice President J.D. Vance exposes 3 decades of silence with 1 day of truth. Even networks known for criticizing the Trump administration couldn't look away. On The View, a liberal host wiped her eyes and said, "I don't agree with his politics, but today he wasn't a politician. He was a voice for the broken." Meanwhile, J.D. Vance had quietly stepped outside to greet a small group of citizens who had waited to see him. Among them, Tamika, the girl who wrote the ignored letter. She held a small notebook and a crumpled photo of her grandma. J.D. knelt down and hugged her. "You matter," he whispered, "and I hear you." That photo went viral within minutes. And Maxine Waters, her office had gone silent, phones ringing off the hook, staff avoiding cameras. The damage was done. That night in homes across America, families who had never watched C-SPAN were gathered around screens replaying the hearing. Not for the politics, not for the drama, but for the raw human truth. An elderly man in Alabama turned to his grandson. "That boy ain't no thug. He's a fighter, not with fists but with fire." In a church in Baltimore, a pastor paused mid-sermon to quote J.D.'s words, "Power without humility destroys everything it touches." Meanwhile, Maxine Waters remained inside her Capitol office. Lights off, shutters drawn. Her decades of control were crumbling under the weight of a truth too powerful to spin. But J.D. Vance, he didn't go to a celebration. He returned to his room, opened his Bible, and sat in silence. He knew this day wasn't about winning. It was about waking people up, and America was finally awake. Just before leaving the Capitol, J.D. Vance returned to the now quiet hearing room. It was empty, just a few forgotten papers scattered on desks. He approached Maxine Waters' empty seat and carefully placed a single envelope on her microphone. It wasn't legal paperwork. It was a letter to the woman who once had the trust of her people. The letter wasn't scathing. It was sincere. J.D. had written it that afternoon during the short recess. It spoke of lost opportunity, of broken trust, and of what real leadership could have looked like. "You could have been a light, ma'am, a giant, but you chose comfort over sacrifice, position over purpose. It's not too late to tell the truth." Outside the room, an aide, young, visibly shaken, peeked in and saw J.D. leaving the note. He didn't say a word. He just nodded, eyes wide with something like respect. As J.D. exited the building, cameras flashed, but his face wasn't triumphant. It was tired, honest, heavy with the responsibility of what had just happened. The country had seen the truth. Now it had to decide what to do with it. The next morning, headlines blanketed every screen. The moment that shook D.C. Vance shames Waters with facts, forgiveness. Thug or hero, America decides. But something else was happening now, something unexpected. In Compton, in Watts, in Inglewood, residents were gathering, not to protest but to talk, to listen. Churches opened their doors. Community centers filled, and in those rooms, for the first time in years, people were angry but also awake. A mother stood up during one local meeting and held her phone. J.D.'s speech played on the small speaker, his voice echoing through the hall. "He didn't yell, he didn't curse, he spoke, and I felt every word," she cried. Back in D.C., Maxine's office still hadn't released a statement. Her silence now screamed louder than anything else. Meanwhile, J.D. Vance returned to his office. His inbox was flooded, not with politics but with pain, stories, letters, truths, and J.D. He read every single one. By noon, it was clear this wasn't just a political moment. It was a cultural shift. Podcasters, community leaders, school teachers, even high school students were quoting J.D.'s words. "Power without humility destroys everything it touches." In a classroom in Oakland, a history teacher paused his lesson and played J.D.'s 5-minute closing from the hearing. When it ended, a student in the back wiped his face and whispered, "I wish my dad could have heard that." Meanwhile, President Trump addressed the nation briefly. In his statement, he didn't gloat. He simply said, "What the vice president did yesterday wasn't political, it was presidential." By evening, Maxine Waters finally emerged. She stood before a dozen cameras, her voice low, but she didn't offer defense. She didn't deny the documents. She simply said, "No comment at this time." And as she turned to walk away, her eyes met a reporter holding up the letter JD had left. She paused for just 1 second, then lowered her head. The damage was done, but something deeper had begun. Truth had entered the room, and it refused to leave. Inside Maxine Waters' district office in Los Angeles, the phones were still ringing, but no one was picking up. Her staff had stopped responding to emails, and the curtain stayed closed. Down the street, community activist Tyrone Fields stood outside holding a stack of unpaid housing repair requests, papers he had submitted 3 years ago. "I begged that office to fix a leak in Miss Ruth's ceiling. Now she's gone. Cold winter, no heat." And they never called back. A news crew approached him for comment. His voice cracked as he held up one of the forms. "She voted for her, loved her, and they let her die under a moldy roof." The clip went viral instantly. Not just because of what was said, but because of the raw grief in his face. Back in D.C., J.D. Vance was in his office reviewing late-night messages from people he would never meet, but who now saw him as a voice for the voiceless. He wasn't looking for praise. But as he held a drawing from a 10-year-old that simply read, "Thank you, J.D.," he knew something deeper had begun. Truth wasn't just trending, it was touching. In South LA, an emergency town hall was held at a local church. Over 300 people packed into a room built for 100. There were no signs, no chants, just heartbreak and a hunger for answers. At the front stood Sister Helen, a 65-year-old woman who had once campaigned for Maxine Waters in the 90s. She held a framed photo of her son. "He was killed in gang crossfire," she said, voice shaking. "I begged that woman for funding to help clean up the block. She said she'd handle it. That was 19 years ago." The room was silent. You could hear sobs. Then someone played a clip from JD's hearing again. "You chose comfort over sacrifice, position over purpose." More tears, not because of politics, but because after decades of speeches and broken promises, someone had finally spoken the truth without fear. Meanwhile, Maxine Waters' mansion sat guarded but empty of answers. The same streets she once used for votes now rose up, not with pitchforks but with stories. The people weren't mad because she fell. They were mad because she stopped caring. Back on Capitol Hill, a sealed envelope was delivered to the Oversight Committee marked "Confidential Internal Memo." Inside were leaked files, unreported foreign donations, shell companies tied to Waters' family, and a voice recording. In the audio, a top aide is heard saying, "The people in the district, they'll vote for her no matter what. Just keep them distracted." The clip was confirmed. It aired across major networks within an hour. America didn't gasp this time. It groaned. And in the hearing room where it all began, J.D. Vance returned, invited back by the committee chair. He said nothing at first, just stared at the seat where Maxine had insulted him hours earlier. "I was called a thug, but the truth is I've never stolen a dollar, never made a promise I couldn't keep. I may not have her years, but I have the people's tears." He paused, then gently whispered, "And I will not waste them." The room rose to its feet. Quiet, powerful, unshaken. J.D. Vance had not only flipped the narrative, he had finished the chapter. As J.D. Vance stood quietly before the committee, something unexpected happened. A Democrat representative, Maria Soto, who rarely crossed lines, rose from her chair. She was emotional, her voice unsteady. "I didn't come here to praise Vice President Vance, but what he did in that seat, it wasn't about politics. It was about pain. And as a public servant, I must admit, I've forgotten that pain myself." Her words echoed across both aisles. Reporters scrambled. Viewers at home sat forward. For a moment, partisanship faded. The chairman cleared his throat, barely able to speak. "I never thought I'd say this, but today we didn't witness a political win. We witnessed a moral one." J.D. stepped back, his hands folded, eyes lowered. He had said everything he came to say, but as he prepared to leave the floor, a slow, respectful clap broke out, then another, then the entire chamber. J.D. Vance didn't smile. He only nodded, not for applause, but for the people behind every word he'd spoken. And for the first time in decades, the House chamber felt cleansed. Within 24 hours, murals began appearing across J.D. Vance's hometown, not of his face, but of the quotes he had spoken in that hearing. "You may hold power, but we carry pain, and pain will always outlast politics." In South LA, a group of teenagers painted that line on the side of a community center, once ignored by the very office Maxine controlled. Meanwhile, New investigations opened quietly into the corruption files JD had submitted. Former aides began speaking out, and one brave voice, Maxine's ex-chief of staff, went on national television and confirmed the worst. "We stopped serving the people a long time ago, and no one had the guts to say it until J.D. Vance did." Social media flooded with stories from Mississippi to New York. People who had felt invisible suddenly felt heard. He hadn't saved them, but he had seen them. And in that, J.D. Vance had done something most leaders forget. He made ordinary Americans feel human again. That night, J.D. Vance sat alone in his office, a single light glowing above. He opened a notebook filled with handwritten letters, every one from someone who had cried watching the hearing. One letter came from a woman named Shanice in Detroit. She wrote, "My son was murdered 3 years ago. I called Representative Waters' office begging for help with community violence programs. They told me to fill out a form online. I never heard back. Today, when you read Tamika's letter, I felt like someone finally saw my pain." JD read it slowly, his jaw tight. Another letter came from an elderly man in rural Kentucky. "I'm white, poor, and forgotten. But when you spoke today, you spoke for me too. Thank you for not making this about sides but about people." JD set the letters down and stared at the wall. His phone buzzed constantly. Text messages, calls, emails from senators, celebrities, activists, but he ignored them all. Instead, he picked up his phone and dialed a number he had memorized from Tamika's letter. It rang twice. A woman's voice answered, cautious, tired. "Hello, is this Tamika's grandmother?" JD asked gently. There was a long pause, then a gasp. Is this really?" "Yes, ma'am, it's J.D. Vance. I wanted to call personally and let you know that I heard you, and I'm going to make sure something gets done." Woman broke down crying. "Nobody ever called us back. Nobody ever cared." JD closed his eyes. "I care, and I promise you things are going to change." When he hung up, he sat in the darkness for a long time. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about promises, and J.D. Vance didn't make promises he couldn't keep. Meanwhile, across the country, the aftershocks of the hearing continued to spread. In Maxine Waters' district, community leaders organized a massive town hall meeting. Over 800 residents showed up, many holding signs that read, "We deserve answers," and 30 years, no results. Local news cameras captured the crowd. Mothers, grandmothers, young men in hoodies, pastors in their Sunday best, all united by one thing: betrayal. A woman named Tasha took the microphone. Her voice shook, but her words were clear. "I voted for Maxine Waters every single time. I believed in her. I defended her. But after watching that hearing, I can't lie to myself anymore. She forgot about us." The crowd erupted in applause and tears. An older man stood up next. His name was Mr. Raymond, a retired postal worker who had lived in Watts for 55 years. "My street has had broken streetlights for 7 years. 7 years. I called her office 14 times. You know what they told me? They said it wasn't a priority, but somehow her family's nonprofit got millions." His voice cracked. "That man, J.D. Vance, he's not even from here, and he cared more about us in one day than she did in 30 years. The room fell silent, then broke into sobs. This wasn't just anger, it was grief. The grief of people who had believed, who had hoped, and who had been abandoned. Back in Washington, Maxine Waters sat in her dimly lit office. Her chief of staff, a woman named Linda who had been with her for 18 years, stood across from her. "Congresswoman, we need to respond. The media is destroying us. Your district is turning on you." Maxine didn't look up. She stared at the envelope JD had left on her microphone. She hadn't opened it yet. "What's the point, Linda? He was right." Linda froze. "What?" "He was right," Maxine repeated, her voice hollow. "I stopped listening. I stopped caring. I got comfortable, and I forgot why I came here in the first place." Linda didn't know what to say. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, she saw her boss not as a powerful congresswoman, but as a broken woman. "So what do we do?" Linda asked quietly. Maxine finally looked up, her eyes red and tired. "I don't know, but I can't lie anymore." She reached for the envelope. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was J.D.'s handwritten letter. The words were simple, but they hit like a hammer. "Congresswoman Waters, I didn't come to that hearing to destroy you. I came to save the people you forgot. You once fought for justice. Somewhere along the way, you traded that fight for comfort. It's not too late to remember who you were. But it starts with the truth. And the truth is you failed them. Now the question is, will you own it, or will you keep hiding, Sincerely, J.D. Vance. Maxine set the letter down and covered her face with her hands. She wept. Not the tears of a victim, but the tears of someone who finally saw themselves clearly. Linda quietly left the room, closing the door behind her. Outside, the world was changing. Inside, Maxine Waters was finally waking up. The next morning, major news outlets reported something unexpected. Maxine Waters had requested an emergency press conference. Reporters scrambled. Was she going to resign? Deny the allegations? Attack J.D. Vance again? 10 a.m. Maxine walked into a packed press room. She looked different. No heavy makeup, no designer suit, just a simple black dress and a tired face. She stepped up to the podium. Cameras flashed. Reporters leaned forward. She took a deep breath. I'm not here to make excuses. I'm not here to deny what was said in that hearing. I'm here to tell the truth. The room went silent. For 30 years, I have served in Congress, and for many of those years, I believed I was doing the right thing. But somewhere along the way, I lost my way. I got comfortable. I stopped listening. I stopped caring the way I should have. Her voice cracked. Vice President Vance was right. I failed my district. I failed the people who trusted me, and I am deeply, deeply sorry, reporters gasped. This was not what anyone expected. I have spent the last 24 hours reading letters from people in my district, people who called my office and were ignored, people who needed help and were turned away, and I am ashamed. She paused, wiping her eyes. I don't know if I can fix this. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness. But I can start by telling the truth. And the truth is, I was wrong. She looked directly into the camera. To Tamika, to Mrs. Claudine Harris, to every person I let down, I am sorry. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I will spend whatever time I have left in office trying to make things right. She stepped away from the podium and walked out without taking questions. The room erupted. Reporters shouted, cameras flashed, but Maxine didn't look back. For the first time in decades, she had spoken from the heart, and America didn't know what to do with it. Within hours, the clip of Maxine's apology went viral. Reactions were mixed. Some people said it was too little, too late. Others said it took courage to admit the truth. But one person's reaction mattered most. In his office, J.D. Vance watched the press conference on his laptop. When it ended, he sat back in his chair and closed his eyes. His assistant knocked on the door. "Sir, the media wants a comment on Congresswoman Waters' apology." J.D. shook his head. No comment. She did what she needed to do. Now it's up to her district to decide what comes next. Assistant nodded and left. J.D. stood and walked to the window, looking out over Washington. He didn't feel victorious. He felt tired, but he also felt something else. Hope, because if Maxine Waters could admit the truth after 30 years, maybe others could too. Maybe this was just the beginning. That evening, J.D. received a call from an unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something told him to pick up. "Hello, Mr. Vice President, this is Tamika." J.D. sat up straight. "Tamika, how are you?" "I'm okay. I just wanted to say thank you. My grandma and I, we watched everything. And today someone from Congresswoman Waters' office called. They said they're going to help us find a new place." J.D. smiled, the first real smile he'd had in days. "That's wonderful, Tamika. I'm so glad." "Mr. Vance, yes. You didn't have to help us, but you did, and I'm going to remember that forever." J.D.'s throat tightened. "You take care of your grandma, okay? And if you ever need anything, you call me." "I will, thank you." When the call ended, J.D. sat in silence. This was why he did it. Not for the headlines, not for the applause, for Tamika. For every forgotten child, every ignored grandmother, every broken promise. In Los Angeles, the town hall meetings continued. But something had shifted. People weren't just angry anymore. They were organizing. Community leaders formed accountability councils. Residents demanded transparency. And slowly, Maxine Waters' office began to respond. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't fast, but it was a start. 1 month later, J.D. Vance was invited to speak at a community center in Watts. He accepted immediately. When he arrived, the place was packed. Families, children, elderly residents all gathered to hear him speak. But J.D. didn't give a speech. Instead, he asked questions. "What do you need? What can I do to help?" For 2 hours, he listened. He took notes. He shook hands. He hugged crying mothers. And when he left, he didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He simply said, "I hear you and I won't forget you." A local pastor walked him to his car. "You know, Mr. Vice President, people around here don't trust politicians, but they trust you. You know why?" J.D. shook his head. "Because you didn't just talk, you listened. And that's something we haven't had in a long time." JD nodded, his heart heavy but full. "I'll keep listening, I promise." As he drove away, he looked in the rearview mirror at the community center. People were still standing outside, waving. And for the first time in his political career, J.D. Vance felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. 3 months after the hearing, Congress passed a sweeping ethics reform bill. It included strict transparency requirements for family members of elected officials, mandatory financial disclosures, and protections for whistleblowers. The bill was nicknamed the Vance Act. When reporters asked J.D. about it, he deflected. "This isn't about me. This is about making sure what happened to Tamika's family never happens again." But privately, he knew the truth. That hearing, that moment when he stood up to Maxine Waters, had changed everything. It had reminded America that the truth still mattered, that courage still mattered, that one person standing in the right place at the right time could change the course of history. And J.D. Vance, the man once called a thug, had done exactly that. In the months that followed, Maxine Waters quietly announced she would not seek re-election. Her statement was brief. "It's time for new leadership. I hope my successor will serve with the integrity I failed to show." She didn't disappear entirely. She began volunteering at a local food bank, working directly with the people she had once represented. No cameras, no press releases, just service. One day she ran into Mrs. Claudine Harris, the woman J.D. had mentioned in the hearing. Maxine approached her nervously. "Mrs. Harris, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for everything." Mrs. Harris looked at her for a long moment. Then, to Maxine's surprise, she hugged her. "We all make mistakes, baby, but it takes a strong woman to admit them." Maxine broke down in that embrace. And in that moment she felt something she hadn't felt in years: forgiveness. Meanwhile, J.D. Vance continued his work. He traveled to forgotten communities across America. He listened to their stories. He fought for their needs. And slowly, trust began to rebuild. 1 year after the hearing, J.D. was invited to speak at a national conference on poverty and justice. The room was filled with activists, politicians, and community leaders. But when J.D. took the stage, he didn't talk about policy. He talked about people. "I once met a little girl named Tamika. She wrote a letter asking for help and no one answered. Today, Tamika and her grandmother are in a safe home. Not because of me, but because the truth finally mattered more than politics." The audience stood and applauded, but J.D. raised his hand. "Don't applaud me. Applaud every person who has the courage to speak up when they've been ignored. Applaud every whistleblower who risks everything to expose corruption. Applaud every community leader who fights for their neighbors when no one else will." The room erupted again, but this time with something deeper than applause. It was hope. As J.D. left the stage, a young woman approached him. She was a college student studying political science. "Mr. Vice President, I just want you to know you're the reason I'm going into public service. You showed me that it's possible to fight for what's right and win." J.D. smiled. "Just remember, it's not about winning. It's about serving. The moment you forget that, you become what you fought against." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "I won't forget." And as J.D. walked out of that conference hall, he thought about how far things had come. One hearing, one moment of truth, one refusal to back down. That's all it took to change everything. Because the truth, no matter how long it's buried, always finds a way to the surface. And when it does, it doesn't just expose the darkness. It lights the way forward. Back in Washington, the halls of Congress felt different now. There was a new awareness, a new accountability. Members on both sides of the aisle were more careful, more transparent, more connected to the people they served. It wasn't perfect. Politics never is. But it was better. And in a small apartment in Watts, Tamika sat at her kitchen table doing homework. Her grandmother, now in a safe, warm home, made dinner in the background. On the wall hung a framed photo. It was the picture of Tamika hugging J.D. Vance outside the Capitol. Underneath, her grandmother had written in careful handwriting, "The day someone finally listened." Tamika looked at that photo every day. And every day it reminded her that her voice mattered, that she mattered. And that no matter how forgotten you feel, there's always someone willing to fight for you. You just have to keep speaking up, keep telling your truth, because eventually someone will hear. And when they do, everything can change. Years later, historians would look back at that hearing as a turning point in American politics. They would study the transcripts, analyze the speeches, debate the impact. But for the people who lived through it, for the Tamikas and the Mrs. Harrises and the Sister Helens, It wasn't about history. It was about being seen. It was about a moment when someone in power remembered that power isn't about privilege. It's about responsibility. And J.D. Vance, the man who came from nothing, who was called a thug, who refused to be silenced, had reminded an entire nation of that truth. He didn't do it with anger. He didn't do it with arrogance. He did it with something far more powerful. He did it with the pain of the people he served. And that pain, that truth, that courage, it changed everything. Because in the end, that's what real leadership looks like. It's not about the loudest voice or the biggest platform. It's about standing up when everyone else sits down. It's about speaking truth when everyone else stays silent. It's about remembering that behind every statistic, every policy, every vote, there's a human being who just wants to be heard. J.D. Vance never forgot that. And because he didn't, America remembered what it means to truly serve. The ripple effects of that single hearing continued for years. Young politicians entering Congress would cite J.D. Vance's testimony as their inspiration. "I want to be the kind of leader who listens," they'd say. Community organizers used clips from the hearing in their training sessions, teaching people how to hold their representatives accountable. And in classrooms across America, teachers showed the footage as an example of courage under pressure. One high school civics teacher in Chicago made it required viewing. After the video ended, a student raised her hand. "Mr. Davis, why did it take so long for someone to speak up?" The teacher thought carefully. "Because speaking truth to power is dangerous. It costs something." Mr. Vance knew he might be attacked, mocked, dismissed, but he did it anyway. That's what courage looks like. Another student spoke up. "But what about Congresswoman Waters? Is she a bad person?" Mr. Davis shook his head. "She's a human person. She made mistakes, big ones, but she also did something brave in the end. She admitted the truth. That's not easy either." The classroom fell silent thinking. Then another student asked, "So what do we do? How do we make sure this doesn't happen again?" And Mr. Davis smiled. "You pay attention, you ask questions, you vote, you demand better. You become the leaders you wish you had." That answer resonated. Because the hearing wasn't just about J.D. Vance or Maxine Waters. It was about every citizen who had ever felt powerless, every voter who had ever been ignored, every child who had ever needed help and didn't get it. In communities across America, the hearing sparked a movement. People started showing up to city council meetings. They started asking their representatives hard questions. They started demanding receipts, transparency, results. And slowly, the culture began to shift. Politicians who had grown comfortable were now being challenged. Corruption that had been hidden was now being exposed. And the people, the everyday Americans who had been forgotten, were finally being heard. 5 years after the hearing, J.D. Vance was asked to reflect on that day in an interview. The journalist, a young woman from NPR, asked, "Mr. Vice President, when you walked into that hearing, did you know it would change everything?" J.D. thought for a moment. "No, I just knew I couldn't stay silent. I had made a promise to myself a long time ago. I promised that if I ever got to a position of power, I would use it for the people who didn't have any. That day, I kept that promise." "But you were called a thug. That's a deeply personal attack. How did you stay so calm?" J.D. smiled slightly. "Because I've been called worse. Growing up poor, growing up the way I did, you develop thick skin. But more than that, I knew the moment she said it that I had already won. Not because of me, but because the truth was on my side. And the truth always wins eventually. It just takes someone willing to speak it." The journalist nodded. "And what about Congresswoman Waters? Have you spoken to her since?" "Once," J.D. said. "About a year after the hearing, she called me. We talked for about an hour. She apologized not just for the insult, but for everything. And I told her what I meant when I said I forgave her. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, it's about releasing the burden for both of us." "Do you think she's changed?" "I think she's trying, and that's all any of us can do. Try to be better today than we were yesterday." The interview ended, but the conversation continued. Because the story of that hearing wasn't over. It would never be over. It had become part of the American story, a reminder that democracy isn't just about elections and laws. It's about people, real people with real pain and real hope. And as long as there are people willing to fight for each other, willing to speak up, willing to demand better, democracy will survive. J.D. Vance proved that. Maxine Waters, in her own way, proved that too. And millions of Americans watching from their living rooms, their community centers, their church basements, they proved it as well. By caring, by paying attention, by refusing to give up on the idea that their voices mattered. Because they do, every single one. 10 years after the hearing, Tamika graduated from college. She majored in public policy. She had decided, after everything she had experienced, that she wanted to help other kids like her. Kids whose letters went unanswered. Kids whose voices were ignored. Kids who just needed someone to care. At her graduation, her grandmother sat in the front row, tears streaming down her face. And in the audience, unannounced and unnoticed, sat J.D. Vance. He had kept in touch with Tamika over the years. Quiet check-ins, occasional phone calls, making sure she had what she needed. He had paid for part of her college tuition anonymously. He had written her a letter of recommendation for grad school. And now, he was here to see her walk across that stage. When Tamika's name was called, she walked proudly, her cap decorated with the words, "For every forgotten child." The crowd applauded, and J.D., sitting in the back, wiped his eyes. This was the real victory, not the headlines, not the political wins. A young woman who had been ignored, now empowered. A future leader, shaped by pain but not defined by it. After the ceremony, Tamika spotted J.D. in the crowd. She ran to him and hugged him tight. "You came." "Of course I came. I wouldn't miss this for the world." "Mr. Vance, I don't know how to thank you." J.D. shook his head. "You already did. You kept going. You didn't give up. You turned your pain into purpose. That's all the thanks I need." Tamika smiled through tears. "I'm going to work in Congress one day, and when I do, I'm going to be the kind of representative you taught me to be. The kind who listens. I believe you. And when you get there, remember this moment. Remember what it felt like to be ignored, and never ever let that happen to someone else." "I won't, I promise." And with that, Tamika walked back to her family, diploma in hand, future bright. J.D. watched her go, his heart full. He had been called many things in his life. Poor, forgotten, thug. But today, watching Tamika, he knew what he really was. A servant, not perfect, not without flaws, but someone who had tried every single day to make the world a little better than he found it. And in the end, that's all any of us can do. Try, fight, listen, serve. The story of that hearing, of J.D. Vance and Maxine Waters, of Tamika and Mrs. Harris, it became legend. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. And in a world full of manufactured moments and scripted responses, real is what people hunger for. Real pain, real courage, real change. So if this story moved you, if it reminded you that one voice can make a difference, then don't stay silent. Speak up. Demand better. Hold your leaders accountable. And most importantly, remember that you matter. Your voice matters. Your pain matters. Your hope matters. Because somewhere, someone is waiting for a person like you to stand up and speak truth. To refuse to be silenced. To fight for what's right, even when it costs you everything. That's what J.D. Vance did. That's what you can do too. The hearing that shook America wasn't just a political moment. It was a human moment. A reminder that behind every policy failure, there's a person suffering. Behind every broken promise, there's a family in pain. And behind every act of courage, there's a choice. The choice to speak up or stay silent. The choice to fight or give in. The choice to serve or be served. J.D. Vance made his choice that day. And in doing so, he changed the course of history. Not with violence. Not with anger, but with truth. Simple, painful, powerful truth. And that truth echoed through the halls of power, through the streets of forgotten neighborhoods, through the hearts of millions who had been waiting, hopping, praying for someone to finally say what needed to be said. Dear viewers, if this story touched you, if it gave you hope, if it reminded you why truth matters, please share it. Like this video. Comment below with the name of someone who inspired you to be better. Subscribe to this channel so we can keep telling stories that matter, stories that heal, stories that change lives. Because this wasn't just a hearing. This was a moment when America remembered what it means to be great. Not through power or wealth, but through service. Through sacrifice. Through love. And you, yes you, watching this right now, you are part of that story. Don't ever forget it.